Shalom to everyone. I want to welcome all our participants from across the country. I'm Dina Waktel, and on behalf of the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Before we begin, I just want to thank my colleagues, Ella Davis and David Stampler, for helping us arrange this Zoom call. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Ambassador Ido Aharoni. Ambassador Aharoni is a prominent speaker who brings a wealth of knowledge and is well known for his insightful analysis of various topics related to Israel, the Jewish community in North America and its relationship to Israel, and much more. Ambassador Aharoni serves as a global distinguished professor at NYU's program of international relations in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Aharoni is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service, a public diplomacy specialist, and founder of the Brand Israel program, who served as Israel's longest-serving consul general in New York, overseeing the operations of Israel's largest diplomatic mission worldwide. Throughout the talk, you may post your questions in the chat box, and hopefully Ido will have the time to cover many of the questions, because in addition, we received lots of questions via emails. So the topic is important, it's complex. Let's jump right into it. Ido, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dina, for putting together this event, and thank you all. I see the numbers are rising up of the people logging in, and so I want to thank all of you that for taking the time on a quiet Sunday to hear about the the mayhem here in Israel. What I would like to do is share with you some slides. I don't have too many slides because I really would like to leave enough time to engage in a discussion. So with your permission, let me share the slides with you, and then we can start. And properly, I titled my talk as "What Just Happened," because only 3.5 months ago, we were not in this situation. And the question is really what happened, because there were no early warning signs. And let me explain. So as you may recall, in late 2022, we had yet another round of national elections, and those were the results. And you can see that when you look at the number of votes, the Likud-led coalition, which is in light blue here, won 49.57% of the total number of kosher votes, which is only 30,000 more than the number of votes that went to the other camp, the opposition camp. However, when you look at the number of seats in the Israeli Knesset, and these are because of parliamentary structural issues, that coalition, with a very small majority of 30,000 votes out of nearly 2.4 million votes, was able to put together a coalition of 64 as opposed to 56. Now, that coalition, led by Mr. Netanyahu, and here you can see a very interesting chart that was produced by the Israel Democracy Institution, IDI, that shows you how divided the Israeli population is when it came to this election. As you can see, close to 100% from the Haredi population at the very bottom of the chart voted for the right, and close to, and a little bit over 96% of the Arab population voted for the left. And then here you can see in the kibbutzim, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And of course, in the settlements, it's an interesting slide. I will share the entire deck with Dina after the presentation so that you can view the slides yourselves. In any event, when Mr. Netanyahu announced that he was able to form the coalition, he held a press conference in which he stated 4 priorities for his new coalition. And he said, number 1, we will fight Iran's aspirations to become a nuclear power. Number 2, we will fight cost of living, try to, I don't know if you know that, but Israel is a very expensive place. We will enhance security and safety, not only in the context of terrorism, but also in the context of crime in our cities. And number 4, we will aspire to further normalize Israel's ties with our Arab countries. And specifically, it was described that Mr. Netanyahu would like his coalition to warm up their ties with Saudi Arabia and possibly even have a deal with Saudi Arabia. And so no one around Netanyahu, certainly not Mr. Netanyahu himself, spoke about the need to reform Israel's judiciary. And so that came as a big surprise to the entire Israeli population, when the first thing that the government did, very aggressively, very swiftly, very quickly, is introduced a series of changes to the Israeli judiciary reform. Now, judiciary system. Now, it should be mentioned that Israel's judicial system is an easy target because there's a wide consensus among Israelis that the system needs some improvements. It needs improvements because of lack of efficiency. It needs improvement in the area of the quality of the judges. Not just the Supreme Court in Israel is of very high quality, but when you go to the rest of the judicial system, the encounter of the average Israeli with the Israeli judicial system is not very pleasant, to say the least. So it was a very easy target. Vast majority of Israelis will tell you, yes, the Israeli judicial system does need a serious reform. It needs to be upgraded. It needs more budgets, more courts, more judges. The training of the judges needs to be, more in-depth, and so on and so forth. But surprisingly, what the coalition did is not that. The coalition introduced a series of propositions that were meant to weaken the independence, to erode the independence of the judicial system, and de facto turn it into a sub-branch of the executive branch. Now, spokespersons on behalf of Mr. Netanyahu, including Mr. Netanyahu himself, denied it. They said, no, on the contrary, this will be actually an improvement. It will enhance Israeli democracy. It will enhance the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Until a few weeks ago, the Minister of Justice, Mr. Yariv Levin, went on television, Channel 14, which is like the Israeli equivalent of Fox News, and admitted openly that the actual implication of his proposed changes is the elimination of Israeli checks and balances. And he said, it means that all 3 branches will be united or converged into one, the executive branch, and that's not democracy. He said it himself, reaffirming all the fears of Israelis that viewed those proposed changes. And remember, Israelis do believe that the judicial system needs an upgrade. It does need a reform. But this is not what the coalition was proposing. And so specifically, they targeted the Supreme Court, failing to realize that the Supreme Court has been a very loyal shield and consistent shield for all Israeli governments when it came to international bodies dealing with international law, like the International Court of Justice and so on. They targeted the independence of the legal advisors in the various governmental agencies, claiming that the legal advisors should be appointed by the politicians themselves. And without going into much detail, basically what they were trying to introduce in the name of governance, in the name of trying to improve Israeli governance, which certainly needs improvement, what they try basically to introduce is an unrestricted form of executive branch. Now, that's very difficult to explain to people who are not familiar with the history of Israel. But we have to understand that when Israel was founded, it was founded with no constitution and with no separation between state and religion. And beyond that, the checks and balances of the Israeli system were crippled to begin with. Why? Because the Israeli legislative branch, if to use a Canadian example, is it looks at Israel as one district. Imagine 120 elected officials are being elected from one district, all from the same district. What does it mean? It means that they don't really have a clear idea as to who is in their district, what's their constituency. And as a result, their level of accountability is lacking significantly. So even when you look at the ultra-Orthodox parties, there's a huge gap, and certainly with the Arab parties, there's a huge gap between the agenda of their elected representatives and the real needs of their constituency. And that doesn't exist, cannot exist by definition in a system where the country is divided into districts. And I gave a similar talk to a group in New England recently, and I gave the example of how the Republican delegation in the state of New York is reacting to George Santos, and many of them demand the dismissal of George Santos, despite of the fact that it doesn't serve them politically. He's a member of the Republican delegation. And the reason why they're doing it is because obviously there's a pressure coming up from their constituency. The people that voted for them tell them, we don't want George Santos in the House of Representatives. So we begin in 1948 with a legislative branch that by definition is under the executive branch by virtue of the parliamentary majority. If you're able to form a majority in the parliament as government, then it means that you are de facto controlling the legislative branch. And indeed, that's exactly what happened over the years. The Israeli Knesset is weak. It's never been weaker. Just to mention, all the major policy moves introduced in recent years by Israeli prime minister were not introduced in the Israeli Knesset. And I'm embarrassed as an Israeli to say that, because the Israeli Knesset is what we call in Hebrew the sovereign. The Israeli Knesset is the representative of the Israeli people. And I'm embarrassed to say that. When Ariel Sharon wanted to introduce the Gaza pullout, he did not do it in the Knesset. He introduced the Gaza pullout in an Israeli college, private college. When Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to proclaim his support for the two-state solution in the famous speech he gave in 2009, he did not do that in the Israeli Knesset. He went to Bar Ilan University to proclaim his support for the two-state solution and so on and so forth. So the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli legislative branch, is weak and unfortunately is getting weaker. So because of the fact that Israeli checks and balances are crippled to begin with, that leaves us with the Israeli judiciary as the only mechanism to supervise the decisions made by Israeli politicians. And what the government proposed to do meant de facto, and again, in the beginning, they denied it. They said this is not the intention. But then Mr. Levine himself, the Minister of Justice, went on television and admitted that this is exactly the intention. To make sure, in the name of governance, that's his understanding of democracy, we'll talk about that the Israeli judiciary will be actually working under the executive branch rather than alongside the executive branch. And that, of course, created a big shock in the Israeli population, especially people that understand the meaning of it for Israeli democracy, understand what it means to have a government with an unrestricted power. Even if the government is well-meaning, no democracy can thrive when the government has unrestricted degree of power to do whatever it wants. Again, even if they have great intentions. And so the question was, what are we looking at here? Is it a legitimate reform that is meant to allow the government to properly govern? Or is it just a clear political struggle? And more evidence piled up to support the argument that what we're looking at is a classic political power struggle. And the people that led those reforms often cited the Gaza pullout, the disengagement from Gaza, as an example of how a government violates the rights of minorities. However, there's a big difference. When an Israeli government makes a decision about a territorial decision, about the Oslo Accords, about the Gaza pullout, Menachem Begin's decision to uproot the Jewish settlements in Sinai and sign the peace deal with Egypt, these are policy decisions. And they are within the realm of the right of the executive branch. That's why they were elected. When a government decides to go to war, when Menachem Begin decided in 1982 to go to Lebanon, it was within the realm of his jurisdiction as an elected official, because people vote for their leaders to execute their policies. But that doesn't mean the fact that you have a parliamentary majority, certainly not a 30,000 people majority out of 2.5 million votes, that you were given a right to change the very DNA of the nation. That's a different ballgame. And when you change the basic elements, the fundamentals of Israeli democracy, that's not a policy matter. Imagine a president in the United States losing the popular vote, yet is winning the White House, as it happened with George W. Bush, as it happened with Donald Trump, and then giving permission to change the Constitution completely. Can you imagine that? That's how many Israelis felt. And that, of course, prompted massive protests. We'll talk about that in a second. So why are they doing it? Are they stupid? Don't they understand what's happening? Well, the answer is very simple. They truly believe that this is what democracy is all about. Truly believe that. They believe that democracy is about a procedure, and it's about winning or losing. And if you get to win, winner takes it all. And because they see Israeli demography changing in favor of Israeli conservatives, they're assuming we can do it quickly, swiftly, aggressively. Why? There'll be no repercussion. Because the Israeli conservative camp is growing and will be growing because of demographic trends. This was their political calculation, I should say miscalculation. Because it turns out that many people that are considered conservative in Israeli political terms may be conservative when it comes to the economy, they may be conservative when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they are 100% pro-democracy. And they don't think that by eroding Israeli democracy and undermining Israeli democratic institutions, this will do any justice to Israel or enhance Israel's future in any way, shape, or form. The second motivation, so the first motivation is they simply understand democracy in a very procedural way. They don't see democracy as a conversation about rights. It's no wonder that 14 seats out of 120 went to the nationalist, the religious nationalists called Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, which there's no other way to describe this party than the party of Jewish supremacists. It's a Jewish supremacist party because they believe that only Jews have rights. And the whole conversation about rights of others is foreign to them. Well, guess what? Lots of Israeli conservatives, you see them, including people that are religious, are participating in the anti-Jewish reform or revolution, use whatever term you would like to use to describe what they're doing, many conservative people are actually rallying against it. And there's a very solid majority among Israelis today when it comes to that. The second motivation, as I mentioned before, is the revenge on the issue of the Gaza pullout. David Grossman, one of Israel's leading authors, published an article articulating that. He said, at the core of what we're seeing today is just basic revenge. It's a human, feeling. It's a human emotion. These people seek revenge. They feel that Ariel Sharon's government, by the way, at the time of the disengagement, Ariel Sharon served as prime minister under Likud. It was a Likud-led coalition. Only later, he formed Kadima. And then the third motivation, and again, it's 100% authentic, it's genuine. These people are not lying. They're telling the truth. They understand governance not as the government is there to serve the entire public, but rather the government is there to execute its policy. In their case, it's the policy that serves the sectors that voted for them. And they say it. They say it publicly, no problem. They say it publicly. And again, it's quite astonishing to people that have a deeper understanding of democracy as a philosophy, as a way of life, as something that is all-encompassing, as inclusive, is about taking care of those who didn't vote for you either, And again, it's astonishing to many Israelis. That's why the whole thing was such a shock, because there were no early warning signs. Mr. Netanyahu introduced an entirely different agenda, and then the next morning, boom, they introduce a barrage, 141 legislative initiatives in several weeks, unprecedented. So what was the response of the Israeli public? First of all, an interesting thing, the opposition to the so-called reform is not being led by Israeli politicians. In fact, the official heads of the Israeli opposition, Mr. Lapid and Mr. Gantz, are pretty much out of it. They're not part of the decision-making. We're looking at a network of tens of groups of people. They organize, they raise money themselves. Many of them are coming from the world of high tech. Many of them come from the world of the arts and intellectual circles. You could say that the leaders of the protest movement are all members of what we call in Hebrew the serving elites, the people that they do well financially, but they also pay lots of taxes. They punch way above their weight in Israeli economy and Israeli society and their contribution to Israeli culture. And they are critical to the success and the prosperity of the state of Israel. And that's what gives them the leverage. That's what gives them the leverage. That's why the government must pay attention to them, because they are the serving elites of Israel. And without them, Israel cannot prosper. So the politicians are not really directing this. Second thing they did, they appropriated the Israeli flag. And they said the flag of Israel is the symbol and the icon of the protest against the government. And that created, I think it was a brilliant move. I don't know who was behind it, but it was a brilliant move. Third, it's bottom up. When Mr. Netanyahu announced that he was firing the Minister of Defense, within 30 minutes, hundreds of thousands of Israelis stormed the streets of Tel Aviv. No one told them to go. Bottom up. They were so outraged by the way it was done for no reason, really. He didn't do anything. He just said, I'm concerned about the future of Israeli security and Israeli defense forces. When so many soldiers, and you have to understand, the Israel Defense Forces You can't force people. It's based on reservists. I served in the reserves until I was 48. And if I didn't want to spend 45 days a year as an infantry officer, I could have found ways to do it. But I didn't. Whenever I had to go, I went. It's 90% voluntarism. And so he just expressed his concern and he was fired. And so hundreds of thousands of people within 30 to 45 minutes blocked the streets of Tel Aviv. And so Mr. Netanyahu had no other choice. And he didn't really, he announced, I'm sure, I don't know to what extent you guys follow Seinfeld, but there's a very famous episode in Seinfeld where George Costanza is quitting his job. And then he goes and he says, oh, God, what a mistake I made. What should I do? And Kramer advises him, just go back to work on Monday and pretend nothing happened. And that's what Mr. Netanyahu did. He went back to work on Sunday and pretended nothing happened. And Mr. Gallant, the Minister of Defense, was never fired. It's a real life Seinfeld moment in Israeli politics. And lastly, I would say about the Israeli response, the public response, again, unprecedented. I'm over 60 years old, never seen anything like it in my life. And I've seen the protest against the first Lebanon war, which was dramatic. Nothing like this. I've never seen anything that even close to this. But look at how creative they are. It's nonviolent and highly creative. This is from the famous television show, I think it's called The Handmaids or something like that. And again, the coalition continues to fuel the protest by making all sorts of really outrageous announcements. Just today, the chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi, was caught on record, recorded as instructing a minister from his party to break the Israeli law. And he tells him you have to allocate money only to people that do what you tell them to do. Now, it's illegal, so you have to be smart about it. So he's basically instructing him, the chief rabbi is instructing him how to break the law, incriminating himself, by the way. I will not be surprised if he's going to be charged, this chief rabbi. And things like that happen here on a daily basis, again, fueling the protest instead of pacifying it, actually elevating it, which again, quite strange. So the backlash included, as I mentioned, not only the serving elites, which is an internal thing. I can't even begin to tell you how dramatic the influence and the impact of Israel's serving elite is. They are the people who are chiefly responsible for Israel's growth over the last several decades, since the beginning of the rise of the Israeli high-tech sector and life science sector, which was in the 1980s, 1990s. The serving elite is hugely important for Israel's future. And when you lose them, you really don't have a choice. But in addition to them, of course, you have the response of the United States. The United States has a very clear strategy. They must support nations that support freedom and liberty. They must support nations that support democracy. The main reason the United States has such an intimate ties with Israel, such an intimate degree of relationship with Israel, is because of what the so-called shared values. Same thing goes for Canada. The fact that Israel is a democracy is the business card, is the ticket that Israel has to the family of Western-style liberal democracies. And Mr. Biden flatly said that Mr. Netanyahu is not welcome. He was asked, will you invite Mr. Netanyahu to the White House? He said no, flatly. Now, that had tremendous impact in Israel. Add to that other leaders. So Mr. Biden is not alone. We heard the dissatisfaction from other leaders, from Macron to other leaders. The rating agencies. Moody's was the first to downgrade Israel. The rest will follow suit. But the most important thing that is happening is that investors, and I don't have to tell you, there are many investors on this call, when investors sense instability, the first thing they do instinctively is take a step back. So it's not even when the implementation of the proposed changes to Israeli judiciary were blocked and stopped early on. The damage is already done. I know that because I'm working today in the financial field, and I see foreign investors are nowhere to be found. And again, Mr. Netanyahu described them in a recent interview to CNBC as stupid money, he called them. He said it's the herd. They're fleeing away. They'll be replaced by smart money, he said. Why offend and insult the people that invested money in Israel so far and call them stupid money? I don't know. Maybe he knows why he did that. But it's not that the damage will happen once the government will complete the so-called reform. The damage is already happening. It's not something that will happen one day. It's already happening. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars that are not coming in. And this is before the actual changes were implemented. And of course, add to that the fact that investors would like to know, as many of you do, when you sign a deal, there's always the possibility that the deal will go south, and there's going to be a legal dispute as a mechanism that appears in every contract. What's the jurisdiction? When you sign a deal with an Israeli company, in many cases, in case of a dispute, the jurisdiction is going to be the Israeli court system. Foreign investors, especially coming from countries like Canada, like the United States, like the leading European countries, they want to know that if, God forbid, something happens and we're going to end up in court, in an Israeli court, we want to know that that court is 100% independent and not controlled by some politicians. And it's another motivation for the investors to shy away from Israel. And again, as I said before, the response of the Israeli government is peculiar. Here's a slide of a famous René Magritte painting, popularly known as "This Is Not a Pipe." And when Magritte explained why he named it that way, he said, well, it's not really a pipe. You can't stuff it with tobacco, which means it's a representation of a pipe. But what the coalition tried to do is to say, we call it, in popular culture today, there's a popular term called gaslighting. They're trying to say, no, this is not what you think it is. It's actually going to strengthen Israeli democracy. It's actually going to enhance the Israeli economy. And that's gaslighting. And the Israeli public is not buying it. And you see it when you look at the public opinion surveys, that the Likud is losing even its own base. And Mr. Netanyahu is trailing in his approval rating behind the two main opposition leaders. And if elections were held today, he would have been handed a resounding defeat. Resounding defeat. As happened to him in 2009 when he led Likud to its worst performance of 12 seats in the Israeli Knesset. However, something dramatic happened as a result. And again, nobody has an answer to the question as to why it happened. Nobody knows. How come we went from an agenda that proclaimed Iran, cost of living, normalization, and so on, to an agenda that centers around one issue that wasn't even a priority in the campaign. No one really has an answer to that. However, inadvertently and unintentionally, Mr. Netanyahu reshaped Israeli political landscape because a new political camp emerged, and it's a liberal camp. I call it the pro-democracy camp. It doesn't have a leader yet, may not even have a leader for years to come, but there's no question in my mind that this is going to be the camp that will set the tone for the nation for years to come, and maybe even beyond that. And that camp is looking at the proposed judicial reform as something that is no longer relevant. They say what we want now is equal participation. We want a constitution, or at least an agreed upon set of principles that are sacred and unbreakable. And we want a separation between state and religion. Doesn't mean that Israel will not continue to be a Jewish state. It means that the religious politicians will not be playing a role anymore. They will not have access to budgets unless they will agree to be part of the collective. Because what we heard today from the chief rabbi is a perfect sign, a perfect example of someone who doesn't see himself as the chief rabbi of all Israelis. He's the chief rabbi of his own party. And that sectoral attitude, you can't build a future with that. With that tribalism, lack of accountability, you can't build a nation. And so the pro-democracy camp, which doesn't have a leader right now, represents a much more ambitious agenda going forward. And we'll talk about what that agenda can be and how did we end up here. How did it happen that we raised a generation of people that don't understand democracy as a value system, but rather as just a procedure of elections? And whoever wins gets to do whatever they want. Reminds you of someone? I know it does. And so the new defining question in Israel's political life today is, where do you stand on the issue of democracy? And yeah, you will find Israeli politicians that still drink the Kool-Aid and will tell you, yes, those proposed changes will actually enhance Israeli democracy. But after Mr. Levin himself, who's the mastermind of the plan, admitted in his own voice, you can go online and see it, it's unbelievable. After he admitted that this is the real agenda, to cripple Israeli democracy, then that became the defining question of Israel today. Right or left, irrelevant anymore, because the Palestinian issue is off the table, is less viable for reasons that have more to do with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, by the way. The Israeli-Arab conflict is less pressuring, even if there's going to be an external threat posed by Hezbollah or Hamas, or even, God forbid, Iran. This agenda is not going to go away, because the Israelis got a preview, a glimpse into the future of how Israel as a non-democracy will look like. And they don't like what they see. And again, many of those people are religious people. Many of the people that oppose the idea of undermining Israeli democracy. Many people are able to get out of their position. And of course, they're angry and they're anxious. I've never seen anything like it in my life. What are the possible scenarios? So, the one scenario that's already happening And it's very typical of, when you look at Mr. Netanyahu's conduct over the years, he's risk averse. This is why actually Israelis liked him, because he doesn't have, throughout his career, he didn't like to take risks. So one possible scenario, which is already unfolding in front of our eyes, is that Mr. Netanyahu will do nothing. He tried. The backlash was dramatic, internally and internationally. And so he'll sit quietly, will not do anything, will not continue with the implementation of the reforms, and will not announce that he's stopping it. Nothing will happen. That's a scenario. Problem is, if you remember, before the elections, when in the United States, Mr. Trump and his supporters, way before the elections, already expressed their concerns that the elections will be rigged. Do you remember that? Because of the remote voting, because of voting by mail, and so on and so forth. What happened as a result? Do you remember? The Democrats understood that this is the game plan. So what did they do? They increased the supervision and the transparency in every voting station in the United States, recording everything, making sure that when Mr. Trump will raise those allegations again after the elections, that they'll have all the evidence that nothing was rigged. And by the way, Fox News is paying the price for that right now. Same thing happened with Mr. Netanyahu. Many people speculated that the motivation behind the whole thing is because he wants to control the makeup of the Israeli Supreme Court to affect his own legal fate. Well, if that was the intention, then he just did what Trump did. Now, every little thing that this coalition will do that will affect Mr. Netanyahu's personal legal fate has the potential of drawing 1 million, 1.5 million Israelis to the streets. So that's another possible scenario. And again, his trial goes on. You don't read about it a lot, but it goes on. It may take time, but it doesn't stop. And by introducing those ideas to politicize the Israeli judiciary, he actually limited his ability to zero, basically, to personally influence his own legal fate. Another scenario is that Mr. Netanyahu, given the fact that he will not be able to continue with the so-called reform, will not be able, on the other hand, to sustain the pressure coming from his own Likud, from Mr. Yariv Levin and other members of Likud, as well as the religious nationalists, and that will eventually bring down his government. In that case, there'll be early elections, and again, anything can happen in early elections. Likud can win again, but the opposition can win as well. And again, as I said before, remember, because the protests in Israel have no clear leader, it's not clear at all whether Mr. Lapid or Mr. Gantz will benefit from it. Right now, according to the public opinion surveys, Mr. Gantz is ahead by far. He's getting, 29, 30 seats, and Likud's getting only 20 seats. So it looks like Mr. Gantz, for the time being, is the winner of this new political constellation, but that doesn't mean anything. Things can change in 3-4 months. As I mentioned before at the beginning of my presentation, none of us thought that we would be here 4 months ago. So things can change. So that's a second scenario. The third scenario is that Mr. Netanyahu will try to continue to implement the reforms, but he will not have enough votes, because we know he already severed his ties with his Minister of Defense, Mr. Gallant, and nothing happened. he was unable to overcome the objection of the Israeli Supreme Court to the appointment of Aryeh Deri, who was the leader of the Sephardic Party. The Supreme Court basically said, no, you can't violate your own plea bargain and then expect us to allow you to go back to public life. And Mr. Netanyahu was trying to pass a piece of legislation that will allow Mr. Deri to bypass the Supreme Court. That didn't happen. So there is a scenario where Mr. Netanyahu is unable to have enough votes, that 4 or 5 members of Likud will not support his initiatives. And that will lead to an internal Likud breakdown. And fourth scenario, which I mentioned before, it hasn't happened because Mr. Netanyahu basically put a freeze on the process. But if he had continued with the same level of energy and aggression to advance the so-called political judicial reform, there could have been a scenario where the Israeli Supreme Court will basically announce that is not allowed to deal with those issues because it's a clear conflict of interest, which is something that, again, every person in this conversation that is in the world of business understands. You can't take part in changing the very system that is going to decide on your own future. That's a clear conflict of interest. So that's another scenario, but I think that the more likely scenario is that nothing will happen. Mr. Netanyahu will not continue with the proposed changes because it's too costly. It's too costly. Now, what's at the background of this whole thing? We are now paying the price for Israeli, I call it addiction to militarism. What do I mean by that? So from the very beginning, since the early days of the Zionist enterprise in the Holy Land, 1860, this is the year, tomorrow we will be marking Israel's Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day. And when the Israeli Ministry of Defense is counting our fatalities, they begin the count in 1860, not in 1948. Not a lot of people know that. But we begin the count in 1860. Why? Because 1860 is accepted, is recognized as the year of the beginning of political Zionism. And what happened in 1860, the first Jewish neighborhood outside of the old city was created, Yemin Moshe, by the biggest Jewish philanthropist of the time, whose name was Sir Moses Montefiore, was a Jewish banker from England. And so that's when the friction started. And so we didn't have one peaceful day since 1860. When you look at the Arab world as a collective, and again, I'm not making a political statement, it's a factual statement. There's not been one day since 1860 where the Arab world genuinely and authentically accepted our right to exist here as a national homeland for the Jewish people. And that's not a political statement. They also attacked Christians that tried to establish a presence in the Holy Land. The most famous case is, of course, John Steinbeck's family. And the book that he wrote, East of Eden, is based on the trauma that his family suffered here, not far from here in Tel Aviv, in what was known in 1853 as Hopeville, ended with a massacre. But as a result of the unprecedented security and physical challenges that the Jewish community faced then and still is facing today, Israel became a very highly militaristic nation, which means that the IDF is at the very center of Israeli society. It's the number one integrator. It's the number one litmus test. Here you have an image of the Uzi submachine gun that for many years was the leading Israeli brand, right? Before that, you had Jaffa oranges. Then the Uzi became the leading Israeli brand. Israel was known as the producer of the Uzi machine gun, right? Not as the producer of a television show or a dish or a fashion brand, but as a producer of a weapon, because Israel is so militaristic, and understandably so. However, because of the fact that the protection of that very statehood became the only thing that Israeli leaders had to offer the Israeli public. As a result, a void occurred. There is no unifying, energizing vision for the future beyond security. So, okay, Israel is a regional superpower. And according to international press, Israel is also a nuclear power, one of the strongest powers in the world. Israel is a strong economy, thriving economy. Israel is a miracle. But what's the vision for the future? Beyond security? Nada. No leader was able to articulate a vision for the future since Theodor Herzl. Obviously, Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, their vision was to create a state. They had no idea when the state will be created, but that was their strategy. And in 1948, it was the opportune moment that allowed them to proclaim independence. David Ben-Gurion proclaimed independence. Modern day Moses, if you may. The only difference is that unlike Moses, he actually had a chance to lead the people. And in fact, from 1937 until 1965, he was the de facto ruler, 1935 to 65, with the exception of 2 years. He ruled the Zionist enterprise, David Ben-Gurion. But beyond that, protecting the state, there's a need for vision. And that vision is nowhere to be found because we were too busy protecting ourselves. And again, understandably, because Israel faced unprecedented, still is facing unprecedented security challenges. However, the crisis that we're experiencing today is a direct result of the dominance of Israeli military considerations. When security becomes the only agenda, there's a danger. Because if never again is an operational plan, then let me ask you, if the prevention of a second Holocaust is an actual operational plan, is there a budgetary limit to it? To how much money the state of Israel is willing to spend on preventing a second Holocaust? And the answer, of course, is no. There is no budgetary limit. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And so as a result, Israel's performance in the field of education is abysmal. Imagine that we are lagging behind the children of Morocco. As a result, Israeli healthcare system, the science is a very high level because of the universities. But I don't advise you to, go take a look at the accommodations, at the facilities. How many MRIs do we have in Israel? Is there a reason why we don't have 1,000 MRIs in Israel? There's no reason. When people have to wait 6 months for an MRI, there's no reason for it. But that's what happens when security becomes the only consideration. The only consideration. That's what happens. When never again becomes a work plan, a business plan. Well, never again has to be a principle, has to be a guide. It cannot be a work plan. Because if it is a work plan, then no energy, no budget will be left for the other things, as we now see. There's a whole generation of young Israelis that don't understand the meaning of democracy. And it didn't happen just like that. It happened because the state of Israel did not invest enough in the periphery, in the small development towns in the Negev, or up in the Galilee. The state of Israel did not insist that ultra-Orthodox children will study English and mathematics because they're growing into poverty. They're unable to compete in today's world with no English and math. And the state of Israel did not invest enough in its Arab sector, trying to bring them in to be part of that tremendous miracle of Israeli creativity. So a unifying strategy is needed going forward, something that will energize the Israeli people. What that strategy could be. What's next? What could be the opportunity? Because you have to understand that this tremendous tectonic shift, this tremendous historical crisis also presents an historical opportunity. What that opportunity could be. And in my humble view, and I'm an optimist, I think that the opportunity is to go back to fundamentals, to go back to basics. Herzl already said it for us. In Herzl's mind, the future Jewish state was to be a bastion of knowledge and creativity and science. He did not envision a humongous military bunker that Israel became. He wanted a light unto the nation, to create a society that is a model for the world, a marvel, a society that is based on equality. He, by the way, spoke about women's rights in late 19th century. I don't know if Monette is on the call, but he was a pioneer in his understanding. Right, today we talk about, a lot of people talk about diversity and inclusion in American corporate world, North American corporate world. Theodor Herzl spoke about it in late 19th century. And I'll share with you the slides, the things that he wrote in the Jewish state and in the Old Newland, Alt Neuland, the kind of vision that he had. With the exception, in his mind, Israel would thrive and survive under the umbrella of world powers, the empires of the time. So he didn't really pay any attention to the need of Israel to have its own means to protect itself. And that was, that was obviously something that is not sustainable in his vision. But when you look at the other fundamentals of what Herzl was talking about, Herzl was talking about the creation of a unique society that will be an inspiration for the whole world. And believe it or not, from the depth of the current crisis, we have all the necessary tools to turn Israel into a light unto the nations. But what we need to do in order to get there is to understand that we need to act and think as a collective. And when people are elected to represent us in the Israeli legislature or in the Israeli executive branch, their job is not to take care of the party. Their job is not to take care of themselves. Their job is not to take care of their family and relatives. Their job is to take care of all of us, including those who did not vote for them. And they have a very difficult time understanding that. And again, it's not uniquely Israeli. This leadership crisis is across the board. It's all over the world, especially North America. It's all over the world. And you see that fragmentation. So Herzl was very clear in his vision. If you will, it is not a dream. It became a mantra of our people. He was able to articulate a vision, and he was able to inspire people around that vision. That's what's missing today. And I believe that it is possible. To put things in perspective, and then I'll open the floor for your questions. What you're seeing today is part of an age-old debate within Judaism between what we call universalism, represented by people like Albert Einstein, Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, and others, and Jewish particularism, which is more centered around the needs of the community, looking at the Jewish experience as a particular experience, not as a universal experience, less concerned about the world, more concerned about their own community. To mention again the chief rabbi's statement from today, it's a perfect example of ethnocentrism, right? I'm at the center of the world. I take care of only the things that I care about, and I don't care about the rest. And the tension between universalism and particularism in Judaism was always present. And so I think that what we're seeing today is a clash between the two. But as I said before, I believe it is possible to go back to Herzl's vision and to really turn Israel into a light unto the nations. And with that, I'd like to thank you and open the floor for your questions. Dina.
Thank you very much, Ido. Thank you, Ido. And by the way, Monet is on the call and she's saying hi. I want to, tomorrow we are going to mark the day, the Memorial Day for the Israeli fallen soldiers and victims of terrorist attacks. And Bernie Schuster is asking, how serious is the fact that ministers of the government are not attending or being disinvited for Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration, before that Yom HaZikaron, and the Prime Minister of Israel canceled the talk that he was supposed to give before the U.S. federations in Israel? Is this not more dangerous than any demonstrations?
Well, I don't know if it's dangerous. I think that they don't feel comfortable knowing that they will face opposition, that they will face criticism. And so I don't know if it's dangerous. I know that this is something that is happening. And again, that's part of the backlash. I don't think they anticipated that kind of backlash, not from President Biden, not from the Israeli public, and certainly not from the Jewish communities. So this probably came as a surprise to them. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and this brings me to a couple of questions that we received via email that pertains to diaspora in North America. Is there a role for the Jewish diaspora in the Israeli current debate? And if so, what would that role be? How do you see the future relationship between Israel and North American Jewry?
So democracy, as I mentioned before, is not a matter of policy. So yes, if you care about Israel and you care about democracy, this conversation is for you. If you don't think that Israel should be a democracy, and there were people in the Jewish world, especially, I mentioned most notably that the late Sheldon Adelson was recorded as saying during the Saban Forum, he was interviewed by Chaim Saban a few years back, and he said, show me where does it say that Israel should be a democracy? Right? The origins of Israeli democracy are very fragile. There's no evidence of democracy in the Bible or in Jewish thought or in any of the Jewish writings. Democracy comes from you guys, from the way you ran your affairs in the diaspora. That's where it came from. And maybe a little bit of British influence. So Israeli democracy is very fragile. If you care about Israel and you care about democracy, I think you need to express your voice. It doesn't mean that you have to oppose the government. As I mentioned before, this is not about right versus left anymore. This is an outdated way to look at things. And I see what's happening. Many people that are politically conservative are hugely concerned with the erosion of Israel's democracy. And so this is not a matter of policy. This is a matter of the DNA of the state of Israel. Imagine someone coming to you trying, in the name of some narrow electoral majority, trying to change the very nature of Canadian democracy. Would you accept that? You wouldn't. It's the same thing.
So tied to this question, this coming week, Ron DeSantis from governor of Florida is coming to meet with, is visiting Israel and meeting Netanyahu. The Democratic Party in the US is getting further away from Israel. One evidence of that was President Biden's comment on not inviting Netanyahu to the White House. Knowing that many American Jews are Democrats, what is the implication of that trend on their relationship with Israel?
Huge implications. Huge implications. Israel doesn't have the luxury of being a partisan issue in the United States. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening in front of our eyes. So this will have dire ramifications for the state of Israel going forward. Dire ramifications. Not to mention the fact that some members of Likud came out against Biden. Unbelievable statements. I wish that they were never translated by the U.S. Embassy and sent to the White House. It was embarrassing for me as a former Israeli diplomat to see the responses to Mr. Biden, to President Biden. But I think that this is, again, historical failure. The fact that Israel became a partisan issue in the United States never happened in 75 years of existence. Never happened.
So Norman is asking if you can comment on what factors could cause the moderate wing within the Likud party or members of it either to, he says, defect or exert pressure on Netanyahu to withdraw the legislation.
Well, they're all waiting. The reason, they're all politicians. And the famous Gerald Post, who was a great inspiration to me, Gerald Post was the professor at George Washington University, a psychologist and psychiatrist whose specialty was personality analysis of world leaders. He was the head of that department, the CIA. And he wrote a book called Politics and Narcissism and Politics, Dreams of Glory. Narcissism and Politics, Dreams of Glory. So naturally, people that are drawn to politics are narcissistic by nature, and they all think that they could become the prime minister one day. The reason why people are not rebelling, quote unquote, against Mr. Netanyahu is because they think simply that they will replace him. All of them. You know, I can name them. They are convinced that they're next in line. That's the reason why they're not jumping into the waters. And so what would make them realize that it's the time to jump? If his trial will proceed quicker, if the pressure on him will amount, I don't know. Right now, he's making decisions and, again, providing us with comic relief moments. Like the other day, he wanted to appoint this woman, a member of the Knesset, whose name is Mai Golan, who became famous for her anti-immigration, not just policies. She actually went into the places where the work migrants in Tel Aviv reside, the poor people that are working in all the restaurants in Tel Aviv, washing dishes, the janitors, all these poor people. She rallied against them so aggressively, with such venom and hatred and animosity. It's unbelievable that we, the Jewish people, produced a person who was elected, who speaks like that about immigrants. And we are a nation of immigrants. My family came from Yemen, for crying out loud. Both my parents came from extreme poverty. Just to hear this woman, Mai Golan. Shame on her. He wanted to appoint her as the consul general in New York. You understand what it means for the African-American mayor of New York to greet such a woman? That's how bad things are. And I'm ashamed to say, as a former consul general, that this could have happened. And so opposition in Israel, I don't know, the Jewish community in New York was too stunned to respond. But again, a Seinfeld moment, same way her candidacy came about, disappeared.
Ido, do you believe that this debate will remain peaceful?
Yes. So far, the demonstrations were not violent. There's no reason. The violence came only from the other side so far. And again, another thing that fueled the demonstration is that the government labeled the protesters as anarchists and so on. And again, insulting them publicly, humiliating them while they were not violent at all. So I don't think it will deteriorate into violence. I don't think so.
Regarding the opposition, do you think that Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are smart enough to stop their infighting and unite their forces as strong opposition to Netanyahu? Or do you believe that we are yet to see the emergence of a new leader?
Yeah, I don't think that they will, honestly, they will not benefit from this at the end of the day. They will not benefit from it because this is all temporary configuration. None of them is capable of presenting the vision that I'm talking about. The person that will become that leader is the person that will present a vision that goes beyond security. And none of them is able to do that. They're not even there mentally. Certainly not Mr. Gantz, who's part and parcel of the military establishment, but they're not there. I don't think so. What we need is a Ben Gurion caliber kind of leader that will be able to articulate a vision that goes way beyond security, that gives people a reason to wake up in the morning and work hard for the collective, for the society, and be law-abiding citizens. It doesn't exist here anymore. We are fragmented into tribes, and each tribe takes care of its own. And the serving elite that is carrying all the sectors on its back is saying, it's all over. Enough is enough. And people don't even begin to understand how important it is, what happened. The serving elite is no longer serving unless it's in its own terms. And the terms are going to change. And I don't think that Mr. Gantz and Mr. Lapid are equipped with that vision to cater to the needs of the serving elite. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Monette is asking, what do you think of Mika Almog's call to the diaspora to get involved?
Well, I know Mika, she used to babysit my daughters in Los Angeles, and she's the granddaughter of Shimon Peres, and I've known her for decades, and she's a lovely woman. And what does it mean? Here's my message to you. Especially, I hear this from my liberal friends. They have a tendency to shy away and to say, you know what, my instinct is to disengage from Israel because Israel is not living up to my expectations. Big mistake. This is exactly the moment where Israel needs you. Now, what does it mean Israel needs you? I don't mean that you have to come here and become involved in the political debate. Israel needs you to continue to support institutions like the Hebrew University, to continue to support Israel as a knowledge-based economy, because it goes back to Herzl's vision. The Hebrew University was created as part of Herzl's vision. And who recruited Albert Einstein? It was Chaim Weizmann, who really took the baton from Herzl and continued. Herzl died in 1904. He published Altneuland in 1902. And Chaim Weizmann introduced Albert Einstein to the idea of creating the Hebrew U in 1918. And Einstein raised the money in 1919. And they broke ground in 1923, and the university opened its doors in 1925. And today, it's one of the best universities in the world. That's the story, my friends. That's where we need you. Right? So I don't know what Mika was calling for. I'm assuming political involvement. This is not, I don't think that's the kind of involvement that we need. Israelis that live here and vote here, they're the ones who should be engaged in the political conversation. What we need world Jewry to do is to continue to support the dream, Herzl's dream, of creating a knowledge-based society that will be a light unto the nation. We have this capacity. We just need a little bit of help, a little push.
And that's exactly the work that Canadian Friends of Hebrew University are doing in Canada. and
I
we will
know that's
continue to
that's
do
why I
that.
love you guys. I love you guys. I told Rami and I told Manette, anytime you need me to, to give you the vision from Israel, I'm happy to do that. I mean, you guys are amazing. I know I'm intimately familiar what you're doing. And not to mention, the Albert Einstein Museum would not have happened if not for the support of Canadian friends.
Ido, I can't thank you enough. We went over time, but the audience stayed with us. We have even one participant who said you articulate the idea so wonderfully. You should jump into the leadership of that camp. Again, you are very knowledgeable. You are passionate, and you articulate your ideas in a terrific way. So we thank you all. And I want to end on an optimistic note, and also personal note, and say congratulations to you, Ido, on changing your status very recently and becoming a Saba, becoming a grandfather to a beautiful, beautiful, healthy young baby, the future of the state of Israel.
Thank you so
Toda
much.
rabba.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much. And thank you to all our audience. And next time we'll cover some more questions. Goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.